On April 20th, 2010, an offshore drilling rig operating in the Gulf of Mexico exploded, killing 11 workers and igniting a fire that burned for 2 days before the platform sank. What followed was not immediately visible. Nearly a mile beneath the ocean's surface, a well that had been declared secure began releasing oil uncontrollably into open water. Initial estimates were uncertain. Public statements emphasized containment. The scale was unclear. Within weeks, it became unavoidable. At the center of the disaster was BP, one of the world's largest energy producers, facing a crisis that would exceed any previous offshore accident in both scope and consequence. The spill did not stop. Day after day, crude oil flowed into the Gulf. Satellite images showed an expanding slick. Coastlines across multiple states were threatened. Fisheries were closed. Drilling operations across the region were suspended.
The best interest of everyone.
BP's assurances shifted as new information emerged. What had been described as manageable became unprecedented. Estimates of the flow rate rose sharply. Attempts to cap the well failed in sequence, each one broadcast in real time to a global audience. The disaster unfolded under constant observation. Government officials demanded answers. Engineers worked under extreme conditions. The public watched as technical complexity collided with environmental reality. This was not a refinery accident or a pipeline rupture. It was a loss of control at a depth and pressure few operations had ever encountered, involving systems designed to prevent exactly this outcome. In the days after the explosion, attention focused on the final moments, but the failure did not begin that night. The conditions that made the disaster possible had been accumulating quietly, long before the rig caught fire. Deepwater drilling was never routine. By the late 2000s, oil companies were operating in environments far beyond the reach of conventional response. Wells were drilled thousands of meters below the surface, under pressures that left little margin for error. Each operation relied on layers of redundant systems designed to prevent uncontrolled release. BP was deeply invested in that frontier. Rising energy demand and declining onshore reserves had pushed the industry offshore. Deepwater projects were expensive, technically demanding, and slow to bring online, but the potential returns were significant. The Macondo well fit that pattern. Located in the Gulf of Mexico, it was expected to produce large volumes of oil once completed. BP held the lease and managed the project, working with a network of contractors responsible for drilling, cementing, and equipment operation. Schedules mattered. Each day of delay added significant cost. Specialized rigs operated on tight timelines, with pressure to complete wells efficiently before moving to the next project. Decisions were often framed as trade-offs between time, cost, and risk. The system depended on coordination. Multiple companies handled different parts of the operation. Responsibilities overlapped, but accountability was fragmented. Critical decisions required alignment between engineers, managers, and contractors operating under separate incentives. On paper, safeguards were extensive. The well design included barriers meant to isolate hydrocarbons from the surface. Cement seals were intended to lock the well in place. Blowout preventers stood as the last line of defense, capable of sealing the well if pressure escaped control. Those systems created confidence. Deepwater projects had succeeded before. Incidents were rare. The industry believed it understood the risks, even as operations moved into deeper and more complex territory. At Macondo, however, the margin for error was narrower than it appeared, and as the project approached completion, the balance between caution and efficiency began to tilt. The core decision at Macondo was not a single shortcut. It was a sequence of choices that gradually reduced safety margins without triggering alarms. As the well neared completion, BP and its contractors faced a series of technical decisions about how to secure it before temporary abandonment. Each decision carried risk. Each was evaluated in isolation. Cementing was central. The final cement job was intended to seal the well and prevent hydrocarbons from migrating upward. The design used fewer centralizers than recommended by internal modeling, increasing the risk of an uneven seal. The choice was justified as acceptable under the circumstances. Testing followed. A negative pressure test was conducted to confirm the integrity of the barriers. The results were ambiguous. Pressure readings did not behave as expected. Instead of treating the outcome as a failure, the data was reinterpreted. Operations continued. The assumption was that the anomalies could be explained by equipment behavior rather than loss of control. Delays were costly. Confidence in prior decisions reinforced the interpretation that the well was secure. At each step, the system appeared intact. No single action violated established procedures outright. Each choice fit within a range of accepted practice. Risk was managed through judgment rather than strict adherence to worst-case assumptions. That approach depended on one condition: that all remaining barriers would hold. As drilling mud was displaced with lighter fluid, pressure conditions changed rapidly. The well was transitioning from a controlled state to one that relied entirely on the integrity of seals and valves. At that moment, the system had no redundancy left. What followed would reveal how much risk had been normalized without being fully acknowledged. The first warning signs emerged in real time, but they were subtle. As drilling mud was replaced, unexpected pressure readings appeared on the rig's instruments. Instead of stabilizing, pressure built where it should have fallen. Flow indicators showed inconsistencies that suggested hydrocarbons were entering the wellbore. These signals required interpretation. On a complex rig, sensor readings can be misleading. Equipment behaves differently under changing conditions. Crews are trained to resolve discrepancies quickly to keep operations moving. At Macondo, the readings were not treated as an emergency. The data was discussed, but not escalated. Alternative explanations were accepted. The assumption remained that the well was secure and that remaining anomalies would resolve as procedures continued. Then the flow increased. Gas moved up the well faster than anticipated. It reached the surface before control measures could be re-established. Alarms activated, engines oversped. Attempts to divert the flow came too late. The explosion followed within seconds. Fire engulfed the rig. Systems designed to contain the well were compromised.
We are not guilty of
Power was lost.
We acted in the best
Control of
interest
the
of everyone.
operation
The evidence
ended
will prove it.
abruptly. The blowout preventer, the final safeguard, did not seal the well. Investigations later showed that multiple components failed to function as intended. Some were damaged. Others had not been maintained or tested under the conditions encountered. The system that was meant to close as a last resort did not respond in time. What had been treated as manageable uncertainty became irreversible loss of control. The rig burned for nearly 2 days. Then it sank, and with it, the last direct means of stopping the flow. The turning point came after the rig disappeared beneath the surface. Once the Deepwater Horizon sank, the well was no longer accessible by conventional means. Control shifted from direct intervention to remote operations nearly a mile underwater, under pressures that limited both speed and precision. At first, the flow rate was uncertain. Estimates varied widely. Public statements emphasized caution in calculating volumes. Early figures suggested a relatively modest release, buying time for response planning and containment. Those estimates did not hold. As video feeds from the seafloor became public, the scale of the discharge became clearer. Oil was flowing continuously, not intermittently. The wellhead was damaged. Existing containment assumptions were no longer valid. BP attempted a series of technical solutions. Containment domes were lowered and failed due to hydrate formation. Top kill procedures were attempted and abandoned. Each effort required custom engineering under conditions few teams had ever faced. Every failure was visible. Live feeds broadcast the struggle in real time. What had
A
once
massive
been an
oil spill has
industrial incident
contaminated the sea.
became a
The
public
environmental
spectacle,
impact could be devastating.
unfolding day by day without resolution. Pressure mounted from all sides. Government agencies demanded timelines. Coastal states faced mounting environmental damage. Fishing and tourism industries shut down as oil reached shore. The narrative shifted. The disaster was no longer defined by the explosion.
We are not
It was
guilty of these
defined by the
accusations.
inability
We
to
act
stop
in the best
the
interest
spill.
of everyone. The evidence will
By the
prove it.
time a successful capping operation was completed months later, millions of barrels of oil had entered the Gulf. The consequences were already systemic. What had begun as a well control failure had become an environmental and political crisis, and there was no way to reverse it. The consequences expanded as the spill continued. Environmental damage spread across hundreds of miles of coastline. Wetlands were contaminated. Wildlife populations were affected in ways that would take years to assess. Fishing grounds were closed indefinitely. Communities built around the Gulf faced prolonged uncertainty. Financial exposure escalated alongside the cleanup. BP established a compensation fund to handle claims from
Deepwater
businesses
Horizon was
and
not a single
individuals.
failure. It was a chain
Cleanup
of ignored
operations
warnings,
ran
cost pressure, and
continuously,
normalized risk.
involving thousands of workers, vessels, and aircraft. Costs mounted daily, independent of long-term liability. Regulatory response intensified. The U.S. government imposed a temporary moratorium on deepwater drilling. Permits were suspended. Projects across the industry were delayed or cancelled. The assumption that deepwater operations could proceed under existing oversight was no longer accepted. Investigations followed multiple paths. Federal inquiries examined the actions of BP and its contractors. Technical reviews dissected well design, cementing practices, testing decisions, and equipment maintenance. Internal communications were scrutinized for evidence of cost pressure and risk tolerance. Legal consequences accumulated over time. BP faced civil penalties under
Massive
environmental
oil spill
law,
has contaminated
criminal
the sea.
charges
The
related to the
environmental
incident,
impact could be
and
devastating.
years of litigation. Settlements reached into the tens of billions of dollars, making the disaster one of the most expensive industrial accidents in history. The industry adjusted unevenly. Standards for well design tightened. Blowout preventer requirements were revised. Oversight increased. But
We are
deepwater
not
drilling
guilty of
did
these
not disappear.
accusations. We
It
act in the best
resumed under
interest of
stricter
everyone.
rules,
The evidence will
with
prove it.
higher costs and longer timelines. For BP, the spill became a defining event. Leadership changed. Assets were sold. Strategic priorities shifted as the company absorbed the long-term financial and reputational impact. The disaster no longer belonged to a single rig. It had reshaped how offshore risk was understood. In the years that followed, BP remained one of the world's largest energy companies, but it operated under a different constraint. The Macondo well was permanently sealed. Cleanup operations continued long after the flow stopped. Environmental monitoring extended for years as scientists tracked long-term effects that could not be measured immediately. Legal proceedings unfolded
Deepwater
slowly.
Horizon was not a single failure.
Settlements were
It was a chain
finalized
of
in
ignored
stages.
warnings, cost pressure,
Criminal
and normalized
cases
risk.
concluded. Civil penalties were assessed under revised interpretations of negligence and responsibility. The financial cost extended well beyond the initial response, shaping investment decisions for more than a decade. Regulatory frameworks changed. Deepwater drilling resumed, but under stricter oversight. Well-designed standards were rewritten. Emergency response planning became mandatory at a level of detail that had not existed before. Redundancy was no longer assumed. It was enforced. The industry absorbed the adjustments. Projects became more expensive. Timelines lengthened. Some marginal fields were no longer viable. Risk did not disappear, but it became harder to ignore. The Deepwater Horizon disaster was not caused by a single malfunction or a single bad decision.
A massive oil spill
It
has
emerged from a
contaminated the
system
sea.
where
The
warnings were
environmental impact
normalized,
could be devastating.
margins were compressed, and success in extreme environments created confidence that outpaced control. When the well failed, every layer designed to stop it proved insufficient. The explosion marked the beginning of the crisis. The spill defined it. And long after the oil stopped flowing,
We are not
the
guilty of
question
these
it left
accusations.
behind
We
remained
act in the best
unresolved.
interest of everyone.
How
The
much
evidence will
risk
prove it.
can be managed when failure happens far beyond the point where humans can intervene?